my figs now, Lilith, ordering her to wait on him. And he tried to leave to her the daily tasks of life in the garden. But Lilith wasn't one to take any nonsense. She picked herself up, uttered God's holy name, and flew away. "Well now, Lord," complained Adam, "that uppity woman you sent me has gone and deserted me." The Lord, inclined to be sympathetic, sent his messengers after Lilith, telling her to shape up and return to Adam or face dire punishment. She, however, preferring anything to living with Adam, decided to stay where she was. And so God, after more careful consideration this time, caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and out of one of his ribs created for him a second companion, Eve. For a time, Eve and Adam had a good thing going. Adam was happy now, and Eve, though she occasionally sensed capacities within herself that remained undeveloped, was basically satisfied with the role of Adam's wife and helper. The only thing that really disturbed her was the excluding closeness of the relationship between Adam and God. Adam and God just seemed to have more in common, both being men, and Adam came to identify with God more and more. After a while, that made God a bit uncomfortable too. And he started going over in his mind whether he may not have made a mistake letting Adam talk him into banishing Lilith and creating Eve, seeing the power that gave Adam. Meanwhile, Lilith, all alone, attempted from time to time to rejoin the human community in the garden. After her first fruitless attempt to breach its walls, Adam worked hard to build them stronger, even getting Eve to help him build that wall. He told her fearsome stories of the demon Lilith, who threatens women in childbirth and steals children from their cradles in the middle of the night. The second time Lilith came, she stormed the garden's main gate, and a great battle ensued between her and Adam, in which she was finally defeated. This time, however, before Lilith got away, Eve got a glimpse of her and saw she was a woman like herself. After this encounter, seeds of curiosity and doubt began to grow in Eve's mind. Was Lilith indeed just another woman? Adam had said she was a demon, another woman. The very idea attracted Eve. She had never seen another creature like herself before, and how beautiful and strong Lilith looked, how bravely she had fought. Slowly, Eve began to think about the limits of her own life within the garden. And one day, after many months of strange and disturbing thoughts, Eve, wandering around the edge of the garden, noticed a young apple tree she and Adam had planted, and saw that one of its branches stretched over the garden wall. Spontaneously, she tried to climb it, and struggling to the top, swung herself over the wall. She did not wander long on the other side before she met the one she had come to find, for Lilith was waiting. At first sight of her, Eve remembered the tales of Adam and was frightened. But Lilith understood and greeted her kindly. "Who are you?" they asked each other. "What is your story?" And they sat and spoke together of the past and then of the future. They talked for many hours, not once, but many times. They taught each other many things and told each other stories and laughed together and cried over and over till the bond of sisterhood grew between them. Meanwhile, back in the garden, Adam was puzzled by Eve's comings and goings and disturbed by what he sensed to be her new attitude toward him. He talked to God about it, and God, having his own problems with Adam and a somewhat broader perspective, was able to help out a little, but he was confused too. Something had failed to go according to plan. As in the days of Abraham, he needed counsel from his children. "I am who I am," thought God, "but I must become who I will become." And God and Adam were expectant and afraid the day Eve and Lilith returned to the garden, bursting with possibilities, ready to rebuild it together. A woman like herself. Why do strangers assume such mystery and power, even in the myths of the earliest human beings? And why is it that so much of the time our instinct is to fear them, to reject them, to harm them, rather than to welcome them? Judith Plaskow's story about Lilith is, of course, an invented myth, to use her words. And in a sense, she creates a subversive story of the beginning of the world and the creation of humanity. But it also foreshadows the Hebrew scriptures, which themselves are full of stories about strangers, how to treat them, whether to trust or distrust them. But we've all been strangers at one time or other. And there is in the book of Deuteronomy a command from Yahweh, the God of Israel, who says, "You too must befriend the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." We should remember that in the Middle East, hospitality is an important cultural element. The manners and customs in the land of Israel were very much concerned with the etiquette of welcoming strangers. Laws about the protection of strangers against oppression show that ancient Hebrew people exhibited a deep-seated feeling of kindness toward strangers, backed up by verses in the Hebrew scriptures that say God himself loves the stranger and keeps them under his special protection. And there are also stories that show this attitude to be problematic when those norms and laws are disregarded. The abuse of hospitality once caused a civil war in Israel among the tribes, which might have resulted in the extinction of the whole tribe of Benjamites. Judges chapter 19 and 20 tell the story of the common law wife of a Levite who angrily leaves her husband and goes back to live with her father. And her husband eventually comes to get her. And they set off late in the day. They try to find shelter that evening in the city of Gibeah, which belonged to the tribe of Benjamin. An old man takes them in, but he's the only one in town, it seems, to practice the custom of hospitality. And soon a crowd of men gather in front of the house, demanding to rape the stranger, the Levite. Rather than that happen, they are offered the wife. And even though they initially refuse her, she is thrown out of the house to be assaulted. When the Levite, who the texts seem to agree is the one who throws her to the mob, finds his wife on the doorstep the next morning, she is almost dead, and he takes her home on the back of his donkey. The chaotic disorder of the tribal community of that period of Hebrew history is the real point of the story. But the Levite then demands justice from the other tribes of Israel, and he notifies them by dismembering and sending parts of the woman's body to each of them, a grisly tale. Hence the horrific attack that takes place on the tribe of Benjamin. The story tells us, among other things, that hospitality was such a valued element of Hebrew life that to go against that norm could bring dire consequences. Unfortunately, tribal violence against the stranger persists to this day. In the 1990s, when the genocidal struggles in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Botswana were taking place, a Croatian theologian, Miroslav Volf, wrote a book that has continued to be a source of inspiration to me in my thinking on identity, otherness, and reconciliation. It's called Exclusion and Embrace. And in it, he calls for theologians to be responsible agents for promoting peace and respectful relationships. Wolf warns against the forces within our cultures seeking to assert tribal identity, occurring especially when extreme imbalances of power and wealth collide with multiple different cultures. Ethnic cleansing was what we called the mass murder that we saw in those countries in the 90s, where it had seemed that diverse groups of people had been living peacefully for decades and, in fact, centuries. It seemed a very non-Western phenomenon, something that we would read about in ancient texts like the bloodthirsty stories of the Israelites. Welcoming the stranger is such a timely message because of the tribal nature of politics and policies we see being enacted in our own country today. Historically, exclusion, rule that was dictated by hierarchies of privileged elites, gave way in modern democracies to inclusion, rights being extended to the middle class, then working men, then women, then racial minorities. And they gave parity in economic, political, and social spheres. Inclusion may mean that we destroy barriers that separate us. And Wolf says that there is both advantage and danger in that. If we erase all boundaries, then how do we know who we are? He says we are who we are, not because we are separate from others who are next to us, but because both are separate and connected. The boundaries that mark our identities are both barriers and bridges. But we get into trouble when we pass judgment on a particular lifestyle, religious belief system, or course of action. We just celebrated Columbus Day, which pretty much is a holiday that affirms the actions of Europeans who came to this land, decided they wanted it, and then judged indigenous peoples as barbarians in order to justify their slaughter and expulsion. As the writer Zvetan Todorov comments on the Spaniards' conquest of Native Americans, the desire for wealth and the impulse to master, certainly these two forms of aspiration to power motivate the Spaniards' conduct. But this conduct is also conditioned by their notions of the Indians as inferior beings, halfway between men and beasts. Without this essential premise, the destruction could not have taken place. So the stranger, the other in our midst, can be dehumanized, as Wolf says, in order that they can be discriminated against, dominated, driven out, or destroyed. The New York Times has counted 487 people, places, and things that Donald Trump has insulted on Twitter, an astonishing number. People criticized in a dehumanizing way include refugees who have come to Germany, who he says have so strongly and violently changed German culture. Undocumented immigrants who, he says, pour into and infest our country, some of the worst criminals on earth, including Mexicans who are bringing drugs, bringing crimes, and are rapists. He also denounced sanctuary cities, which are cities that limit cooperation with the government over unauthorized immigration, and which he says are ridiculous and crime-infested. The feminist philosopher Julia Kristeva says that we persecute others because we are uncomfortable with the strangeness within ourselves. Our weaknesses and shortcomings are projected onto the other, and we exclude anyone who blurs accepted boundaries or disturbs our identities because we like things to be orderly and in place. We want to be in control. And so Wolf asks, why can't we accept our own shadows so as to be able to embrace others instead of projecting our own unwanted evil onto them? Another reaction to the other is indifference, not caring what the fate of another human being will be. Zygmunt Bauman, in his work on modernity and the Holocaust, gives us the example of the mass destruction of Jews, which was accompanied not by the uproar of emotions, but the dead silence of unconcern. Once people see that the system is doing the excluding, then they feel they can participate in it because they must survive. They do not rebel against the system because it cannot be changed. The story of the Good Samaritan is one way to understand the power of indifference. Jesus tells it in the Gospels about a man who was attacked by robbers and left for dead on the side of the road. And there were very respectable people who passed by on the other side without helping. But the Samaritan, of a race that was despised and dehumanized and thought of as the other, that man was the one who rescued and cared for the victim. And Wolf says, in a reference to that story, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho will always be littered by people beaten and left half dead. I can pass, I must pass, he says, by each without much concern. I go about my own business. I start to view horror and my implication in it as normal. We can look at Christian and Jewish stories about the stranger, and they might give us pause to consider how human beings can indeed act with evil intent. But the Bible is also just as full of subversive teachings that butt up against the dominant culture of the elite and powerful. Israel freeing itself from slavery in Egypt. Jesus announcing his mission with the words, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to set at liberty those who are oppressed." The great Jewish thinker Martin Buber called himself a biblical humanist. And John Burens tells the story of Buber living under the Nazis and being aware that Martin Luther's translation of the Bible into Germany centuries before had carried some of Luther's own anti-Judaism into the culture. So he was working on a fresh translation of the Hebrew Bible into German when a group of brown shirts burst into his home, demanding that he surrender all subversive literature. So Buber handed them his Hebrew Bible, saying that its prophetic message was subversive of the very idolatry of blood and soil that Hitler favored. And so welcoming the stranger may well involve us in resistance of those powers that seek to exclude and destroy, that label and name call. Wolf challenges us to have regard for the stranger. He writes, "There can be no truth between people without the will to embrace the other." The work involved in welcoming the stranger, it might surprise or more likely annoy you to hear, lies within ourselves. Wolf says we must explore what kind of selves we need to be in order to live in harmony with others. He suggests that our personal perspective of the other from here must be tempered with a willingness to step outside ourselves and look at the other from there. This self-identification with the other forms the basis of human relations. A woman like herself. In Plaskow's story, Eve saw Lilith and knew that she was not the monster that Adam had made her out to be, but Eve was the one to make the first move toward the other by climbing over the wall of the Garden of Eden. What does our Unitarian Universalist first principle mean in the context of welcoming the other? To affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person confirms that Unitarian Universalism is an open-hearted faith and intentionally diverse, and that we are called to love alike even when we do not believe alike. To do otherwise, because then we judge others into exclusion, is to fall into the trap of the politics of purity. We have seen what a danger that is. As Wolff describes it, the blood must be pure. German blood must run through German veins, free of all non-Aryan contamination. The territory must be pure. Serbian soil must belong to Serbs alone, cleansed of all non-Serbian intruders. The origins must be pure. We must go back to the pristine purity of our linguistic, religious, or cultural past, white nationalists say. Shake away the dirt of otherness collected on our march through history. And so we must remember what philosopher Edward Said says, that all culture is hybrid. So purity is only an excuse for a barrier against acceptance of one another. What Wolff sees as the solution to exclusion is embrace, and specifically the embrace of all in a community by the act of covenant. He says that the dynamic of covenant, being created by values which we agree to share in being with each other, yet also broken by the same humans who make it over and over again, strengthens our ability to welcome the stranger. In a covenant, people cannot see themselves as individuals whose identities are external to one another. Rather, the very identity of each is formed through relationship with others. Viewing the world from there as well as from here means untangling our self-identity with its primacy and allowing ourselves to be challenged by seeing things from another person's perspective. Then that person ceases to be a stranger. It's harder to project dehumanizing images on them once we embrace the other as part of our community. And if in your mind you're dismissing this kind of suggestion as naive, let me remind you of the 5 smooth stones of liberal religion as propounded by 20th century Unitarian theologian James Luther Adams. Adams' theology was shaped by witnessing the terrors of Nazi Germany, just as Miroslav Volf's thinking stems from the suffering of his people during the Balkan Wars a quarter century ago. Adams proposed that liberal religion can combat forces of exclusion and injustice and can instead create meaningful changes and justify an ultimate attitude of optimism. What kind of optimism? The kind that is shown in my final quote from Representative John Lewis, whose activism against the dark forces of discrimination and oppression during the 1960s civil rights struggle was based on his belief in coming together to serve the common good. And he said, "The journey toward the beloved community is a journey of a lifetime. I speak a great deal about the possibility of building one house, one family, and you cannot build one house or one family or one community if you're not somehow consumed by the spirit of love. Let us this morning accept the challenge of welcoming the stranger, of climbing over the walls of ignorance, injustice, indifference, and dehumanization, to find that the stranger is a human like ourselves, part of the beloved community which we strive to build in that spirit of love. Let us, as Eve and Lilith asked each other, who are you? What is your story? May we be the ones who make it so. Blessed be. Amen.